Login accepted.
That's pretty good enough. So you can probably see me from last week. My name is Ryan. Yada yada yada. Same thing as last week. So today is August 9th, and we're going to be doing Windows hacking, actually. And we're just 2 weeks away from tryouts. So hope everyone is learning something and will do good on tryouts. So today we're just going to go over the basics of Active Directory in Windows, then go into some common services, attacking Active Directory, and finally the homework. Yeah. So we'll primarily be covering the password dumping, version exploitation, and pass the hash. There are some other things about Windows that you could perform, like weak registry permissions, privileged token abuse, DLL hijacking, uncoded service path, etc. However, we won't go into those specifics. So when attacking Active Directory, you're going to have all these types of attacks. These are just these aren't even like a fraction of the amount of attacks you can perform on Active Directory. However, these are the more common ones that aren't necessarily CVEs. Again, we'll be going over the ATROP roasting, Kerber roasting, DP API dumping, some Active Directory CVEs, and LDAP enumeration via Bloodhound. So just something to keep in mind. Not everything is going to be like a CVE or um, some recent exploit as you would in web app or Linux. A lot of Active Directory is going to be some old misconfiguration when that are abusable. Basically, a lot of logic bulbs. So just some basics. For the file system, it's very similar to Linux. However, it uses backslashes instead of forward slashes. And the file system usually starts at the C drive. You can have multiple drives like C drive, D drive, E drive, whatever drive. But essentially, the default one you're going to be using is the C drive. Another thing to note is that capitalization doesn't matter. So bro.exe is the same as bro.exe in all caps. Windows credentials. So when dealing with Windows credentials, you're going to be dealing a lot with NTLM hashes. So NTLM is broken down into two sections, the LM and the NT hash. The LM hash is a very old encryption that was pretty deprecated and mostly unused. There are very rare occasions where it is used for like very old systems, but typically you're going to have an MTLM hash, which is noted by the AAD3 section of the LM hash. NT hash, which is newer and still used, is the second part of the NTLM hash. The NT hash isn't very secure, but it's still better than the LM hash, so it's something, right? And then if you look at the NTLM hash, it's separated by a colon, so it goes the LM and the NT hash. When you're using NTLM over a network, you're going to be using NetNTLM version 1 or 2. This is simply used to just authenticate over the network. So whenever you use a password over the network, you're going to be using NetNTLM stuff. The SAM or the Secure Accounts Manager, it stores the local credentials. So it'll store administrator hashes, hashes for local users, etc. LSA kind of stores whatever else that doesn't fall within that category. So it's going to be like service accounts, system creds, cache or domain cache creds. Anything that SAM doesn't hold, LSA will probably hold it. LSAS is a service or a process that handles authentication. So it's basically just caching credentials within a process. It's not too important, to be honest. You don't really see LSAT stuff too much. DPAPI is another form of credential storage. So DPAPI was Microsoft's solution for encrypting sensitive data. So this would be things like Wi-Fi passwords, browser credentials, um, credentials for service accounts, etc. So typically, when dealing with DPAPI databases, they're going to have a master key and an encrypted file. So the master key is encrypted using the user's password and some kind of backup key. So if you decrypt the master key, then you can decrypt the encrypted file that stores the credentials, which is essentially how dumping DPAPI works. It's not a form of hash cracking as you would with like Kerberoasting or something, but instead of a decryption. Some example use cases of DPAPI would be like save browser credentials. So in like Chrome when you put in a password and it says, "Do you want to save the password?" If you say yes, it's going to encrypt it within DPAPI. So that is just something to consider in security. Another example would be scheduled task credentials. So some service some services require accounts to perform actions on. So service accounts can hold the API in secrets so that services can authenticate as users and execute something as that user. So this is the very general idea of what Active Directory looks like. For the lab is going to be a lot smaller scale, but when dealing with enterprise um, Active Directory, you're going to have this times like 20. Um, the biggest idea about Active Directory is that Active Directory is a way to centrally manage all your assets, right? When you're trying to, or whenever like, or sorry, yeah, I guess it's not feasible to have one or a small group of administrators to manage all of these assets, right? A small group of administrators can't handle tens of thousands of users, computers, printers, etc. So Active Directory was a way to fix the problem so that you can centrally manage everything through a single computer. And that would be called the domain controller. So for common services, you're going to have SMB and RDP. SMB is kind of like the Windows of FTP, but SMB is used a lot more in different areas. SMB can be used for authentication, file sharing, among many other things. But for the most part, SMB is going to be used for a file share. RDP or remote desktop protocol is going to be used for remotely managing your computers through a graphic user interface. I think we have more in the next slides. Yeah. So once again, SMB is typically used for file sharing, similar to FTP. And again, similar to FTP, you can dedicate it to the as a null or guest user. This is a configuration and it's not always going to be there, but something to look out for whenever you're dealing with SMB is to just try null or guest authentication. Funny thing about admin or SMB is that if you have admin privileges over the machine, you can perform command execution to through a service. So essentially, if you have admin privileges over a machine with SMB, you can use SMB to create a service and execute a command, which essentially is command execution. It's not necessarily a vulnerability because like an intended feature, but it's just a cool thing you could do. And this is using CrackMap exec, which is a old version of netexec, where you can use -x to perform PowerShell commands. RDP is, as I previously mentioned, allows you to remotely access computers with a graphic user interface. So, unlike SSH, where you only get a terminal, RDP allows you to graphically view the computer as if you were on computer yourself. So essentially, you're just another user on the machine, just remote. So common AD services are going to be like DNS, Kerberos, LDAP, and WinRM. DNS, just domain name service. I'm pretty sure most of you guys know what it does, so I'm going to skip over that. But Kerberos has quite a few steps in how it works. So whenever you're dealing with Kerberos, you're going to have like 4 to 6 steps. Let's see. So first, you're going to have a user. This could be any user, it could be attacker, normal user, etc. But essentially, how the Kerberos protocol works is that the user sends some kind of pre-authentication. This could be an NTLM hash, password, RC4 hash, AES encryption, whatever kind of pre-authentication, as just as a way of proving that you are who you are. So once you send a pre-authentication, you request a T and you request a TGT from the domain controller. You get a TGT back, which is a ticket granting ticket, and then you use that TGT to request a TGS or ticket granting service. Because you have a valid TGS and you're allowed to access service A, assuming presumably, you get a TGS for service A, and then you can authenticate to service A using that TGS. Same concept applies for service B. So the way I like to think of services in general is just that services can be anything, right? It could be essentially like a user, it could be an actual service itself. This is probably like a wrong way of thinking of how services are, but in a general high level terminology, that's what I like to think of services. Services are just your target destination. See, when you dealing with Kerberos stuff and you want to get a TGT, you can use the kinit command to request a TGT and just store it. I believe the default path is like /temp/ARB5 underscore 1000, something like that. But essentially, you get the kinit, the user, provide the password, see where the ticket is stored, then set the KRB5CC name, which is the environmental variable for um, Kerberos tickets. And then you can use netexec to use Kerberos tickets instead of typical NTLM authentication. In this scenario, this is when NTLM is disabled. So if you don't have NTLM enabled on Active Directory, you can't use pools as you normally would. You would have to use Kerberos tickets instead. LDAP is essentially the language of Active Directory. So when dealing with LDAP, it's going to be dealing with a lot of authorization, identification of AD objects, and so on. LDAP is basically like a large database of Active Directory information. So if you can efficiently query LDAP, you can look up whatever information you need from the Active Directory, which is why a lot of tools rely on LDAP to search for information. Some examples of syntax would be the common name or the username would be JDoe. Organizational unit would be people, and then is in the example.com domain. It's pretty straightforward. It does get confusing sometimes, but in general, it's not too bad of syntax. There's an example of LDAP search, which is a tool to query LDAP on a domain. So granted you have valid privileges to query the LDAP, you can perform something like this, where you're querying the LDAP of a Windows machine. I believe this is a domain controller. And then you're looking at the devconnected.com domain, and you're just looking for whatever information. There's a long repository and types of commands that you can run with LDAP search. Personally, I don't use it that often just because I never really had to use it, but it's definitely something good to know for stealth and evasion. WinRM. So WinRM is like the SSH of Windows, where you can essentially remotely log into a account using WinRM and manage it through a CLI. So pretty similar to SSH, you're going to have a user provide a password, what IP are you WinRMing into, and then this is, I believe, is just a script, which doesn't matter in your case. You're just going to be focusing on these three flags. So after you WinRM, you're going to have a PowerShell session on the machine, granted that you have valid permissions and part of a valid group. Not all people can WinRM into machines. There is a configuration for it. So I believe it's the remote management group, remote management users group that allows you to WinRM into a machine. So if a user is part of that group, they can effectively WinRM into the target machine. I'm going kind of fast. Does anyone have any questions yet? No questions? All right. So for methodology, right? Um, in a short context, methodology is all about whatever context you enumerated, right? So who am I? So what user are you, and what can you do? What privileges do you have? What privileges do you have over others, right? That also ties to who are they? What can they do to other people? And essentially, how can you get from part A to part B, right? In the long term, you're gonna have this whole checklist, right? But when dealing with Active Directory, you're not gonna have a giant checklist to mark off, right? You can have the most extensive checklist, but ultimately you're going to be slow and inefficient. You're going to be wasting time on things that most likely aren't even there, and you're just blindly testing. Whenever you're dealing with Active Directory, you always want to try to do something that you have reason to suspect is vulnerable to. So, um, let's say something is vulnerable to the shadow credential attack. You see that some person has generic write or generic all over that object. Because that compromised user has generic all or generic write over the user, you can most likely perform shadow credentials. So it's mostly just about context about what you have and where can you go from there. There obviously won't be a direct path from a user to domain admin, but it's always good to find something that you suspect is vulnerable. Oh, we are doing DNS. So DNS is what Active Directory runs on. Um, So whenever you're dealing with Active Directory, there's always going to be some kind of name tied to the IP address. The domain controller holds a DNS server, which holds the names of all of all the computers connected to it, right? So whenever you're attacking Active Directory, you're going to be modifying your etc resolve.conf file. So by modifying this resolve.conf file, you're pointing your DNS server to the domain controller. This way, whenever you're performing attacks that require DNS, say like Kerberos, ASRope roasting, etc., the protocols know to use the domain controller's IP address, which will then resolve the domains. So always modify your etc resolve.conf whenever you're attacking Active Directory. Um, I believe in the lab I already put it in for you guys, but in any case, just always do this, right? So initial access. When dealing with initial access, in most cases, you're going to be dealing with some kind of CVE. So some pretty notable CVEs are things like Eternal Blue or Zero Logon. We'll go more into those two later, but since Windows is such a very old operating system, it's going to have like all these different CVEs. So if you see a Windows machine from like 2016 or earlier, like 2012, these may be vulnerable to things like Zero Logon, Eternal Blue, Print Nightmare, NoPack, etc. Windows has a very large research into like finding vulnerabilities. So there's always going to be some kind of CVE coming out like every week about Windows. So it's definitely good to just keep in mind of recent CVEs that may be vulnerable and just seeing if the vulnerability is present within your environment. So Eternal Blue. Eternal Blue is an exploit that exploits outdated Windows servers running SMB v1. So essentially, SMB v1 was vulnerable to a buffer overflow attack that essentially allows you to get system at NT authority system user, which is like the root equivalent of Windows. Some requirements for SMBV for Eternal Blue is for network access. So you're going to need network access to the machine that is vulnerable to Eternal Blue in order to exploit it. Occasionally, you may need credentials to perform Eternal Blue. Typically, you won't have to, but it is sometimes needed. Another thing is, of course, SMBv1 enabled along with an outdated Windows machine. So even though SMBv1 may be enabled, it may be patched because of a newer Windows operating system. So I believe like at the very least, Windows Server 2016 is vulnerable to SMB v1 Eternal Blue. And ultimately, you're going to gain system access to the machine. Zero logon. So zero logon is a vulnerability from, I thought it was 2016. I guess 2020. But zero logon exploits outdated domain controllers. And essentially what it is doing is it resets the passwords of all users to null or blank. So what this means is that after performing zero logon, you can use a tool called SMB, no, use a tool called secrets dump to perform a DCSync, which we'll get into later. This DCSync will essentially allow you to get NTLM hashes for all the users within the domain. Some requirements for zero logon would be network access along with domain controllers pre-2020. And ultimately, you're going to get full control over the domain. So for post-exploitation and privilege escalation, the most common tool you're going to be using is netexec. So netexec is a Swiss Army knife tool previously known as pragmatexec that is built utilizing impact scripts. Impact is just very generalized tools that you can use for attacking Active Directory. And netexec uses this or uses these scripts to simplify performing attacks. So some utilization for netexec would be enumeration, attacks, modules, or CVEs, along with dumping credentials. So this first command, that would be an example of dumping credentials with the LSASI module. Dash dash users, that enumerates all the users and their descriptions. So that would be enumeration. And then Kerber roasting is an attack. Bloodhound. Bloodhound is a very good enumeration tool. It essentially allows you to enumerate and sniff out AD attack paths for you. So it does all the thinking for you, and you don't really need to do anything else. Um, Bloodhound maps out all the different attack vectors, what privilege escalation you could do, um, what privileges a user has over another, and it even gives you payloads to use. So Bloodhound really simplifies the process of attacking Active Directory. Some requirements for this is network access and valid credentials. You're going to require some kind of valid credential for whenever you're using Bloodhound, just because you need to somehow query LDAP in order to get information. And that is ultimately what Bloodhound runs on. It uses LDAP searches to get all the necessary information and graph them all together. So there are two main ways that I like to use Bloodhound. One is through netexec using the Bloodhound module. Another would be SharpHound. So the difference between them is that netexec uses its own custom Bloodhound ingester, where it's not the same as SharpHound. This is especially different now because SharpHound is enumerating more features like ADCS vulnerabilities, rather than netexec, which just does ACL abuses. So just something to keep in mind, if you don't have a direct connection to a machine, netexec would be the best bet. If you do have a direct session on a machine, SharpHound would probably be better. Oh, I don't really have a. Do I have a demo? Uh, there. So with Bloodhound, this is essentially what it's going to look like. Within administration, you can upload a file. Oops. Yeah, you can upload a file and then just do something like this where this is a zip file I got from or I got through netexec. You can just upload this and then it will just ingest it for you. I already ingested it already, so I don't just for time's sake. But essentially with let's say you compromise this user, right? If you compromise that user, you can right click this. Oh my God, it's so slow. Add it to owned, and then do something like uh what the hell? Where was it? I don't know, something like this, right? Okay, I might need to buff up the tallying machines. But this is essentially what Bloodhound would look like if you were to use it. Definitely a good tool to use. Uh, let's see. What's a good one? Oh my God. Here. So yeah, you can see that our own user, Ron, is part of this group, the domain users group, etc., right? So you can try to see like where the attack paths go. It's not a very great example, but just something to look out for. So Kerberos attacks. Dealing with Kerberos attacks, you're gonna have authentication protocols, right? Oh, sorry. I see this question in chat. Uh, can you explain what you mean by LDAP binds are being enabled? And for Ray, netexec isn't the same as Metasploit, where it's a bunch of attacks. NetExec is a Swiss Army knife tool to perform attacks like curb roasting, ASRope roasting, etc., while Metasploit targets CVE attacks. So the modules itself are kind of like Metasploit, but ultimately NetExec does more where it does ACL attacks as well. I'm not entirely sure how to explain it, but they are different. But yeah, for I don't know how to answer the unauthenticated LDAP binds question. Yes, Bloodhound is a local web app now. Personally, I don't like new Bloodhound just because it's just slower. It's also like just weirder in general. Um, so yeah, going back to the Kerberos attacks, uh, so you're gonna have two things, Azure roasting and Kerber roasting. Additionally, you're gonna have things like delegations, unconstrained delegation, constrained delegations, RBCD, etc. Good resources for um, these delegation attacks would be Wagging the Dog blog. It's very good oversight on like how Kerberos works and like um all these different delegation attacks. So for Azure roasting, you're going to be abusing user accounts that don't require pre-authentication. So when performing Azure roasting, you're essentially targeting the first two stages of Kerber roasting, which I believe I have a slide after this for that. Um, yeah. Oops. Yeah, so when dealing with Azure roasting, you're targeting the first two steps of um, the Kerberos authentication protocol. So because a user doesn't have pre-authentication enabled, you can essentially request a TGT for that user without providing a password. So with that, you can request a TGT from the KD or the from the domain controller, and then essentially just crack the TGT offline. Some requirements for Azure roasting is network access and a username. So without a username, you can't request a TGT for them because you don't know who to target. There are many ways to obtain users, and you definitely could technically perform Azure roasting without users, but it's not very reliable. I'll get into that one a bit later, but essentially, you're going to gain user credentials when you perform Azure roasting. A netexec command you can use would be Azure roast and then the output.txt. You don't need a password per se, but it is nice to have it. Some additional commands when viewing Azure roasting would be the netexec way or the inpacket way. So even though netexec is built on top of inpacket, it doesn't account for all probabilities or all possible commands. The second one uses uses a user list file to check each user on a domain. So let's say you have a list of users on the Active Directory and you want to see if any of them are vulnerable to Azure roasting. You could use a user file to then kind of brute force who is vulnerable. This one technically also works. I believe this is kind of what Azure Bros or NetExec does, but doing it straight from in packet without like credentials may or may not work. Kerber roasting. So Kerber roasting targets the third and fourth stage of the Kerberos protocol. So after providing valid pre-authentication and getting a TGT, you request a TGS for a service. You then get the TGS back for that service and then you crack it offline. This is because the TGS is encrypted using the service account's password. So if you can crack the password, you can get the password for the service account. Some requirements for curb roasting is network access on the Active Directory along with credentials. For the victim side, it needs to have an SPN set. So if a user does not have an SPN set, it's not vulnerable to curb roasting. And vice versa. If it does have an SPN, it is vulnerable, typically. The biggest vulnerability is not necessarily that SPN is set, but that it has a weak password. And that's the same for Azure roasting. You can have these are features of Active Directory having no pre-auth and SPN set. Those are both features, but it's the fact that they have weak passwords that makes them vulnerable. So that would be the remediation for both of them. Ultimately, upon success, you're going to gain user credentials, and then this would be the netexec way and also well as the inpacket way. So you can use whatever you like. I like to use netexec just because it's simpler, but sometimes netexec doesn't work, but inpacket does. So it's definitely good to try both ways just in case. And when cracking the hash, assuming that the password is weak, you can use hashcat with -A0, which I believe is just a very strict rule. But essentially, with this command, it's just going to auto detect the hash and it's going to determine if it either Azure roasting or Kerber roasting. And then it'll just crack it offline. If you don't have enough resources, this is very slow, but typically it's not the worst. Uh, I'm not gonna know this. You guys can see my screen, right? Yeah, okay. So, what would be a good user? Uh, 1.10 dash U. I think that was the password. And then it would just be adrep listing. I think that's the right password. Yeah. Okay. Hold on, give me a second. Uh, I really should have made it, bro. What? Interesting. There's no password? I love Windows. Or it's just broken. That's crazy. I think my environment is broken. Yeah, I have to double check this, but that would be the syntax you would run. I'm too lazy to use impact script just because I don't really want to. Um, yeah, but that would be the syntax for Kerber roasting and ASRoP roasting. I really should have tested this beforehand. Yeah, just trust. It does work. It worked before. So password dumping. Um, yeah, when dumping passwords, you're gonna have LSAS, SAM, LSA, GPAPI, and ntds.dit. So with LSAS, you're essentially dumping NT hashes from the LSAS process memory. Some requirements, you're going to need SE debug privileges or administrator on the system. So why is this? So with nothing LSAS, you're going to be, there's two main ways you're going to be doing this. One is through netexec, and the other is through Mimikatz. Personally, I like to use the netexec way just because The Mimikatz I use is very buggy for some reason. I'm not sure if it's like a newer version that's fixed, but when you use Mimikatz normally, it just like spams enter. So um, NetExec is just a better way to do it. This would be an example through Mimikatz where you have privilege debug, um, then get the hashes, and then you have the NTLM hash or like the NT hash for the user Novak. Dumping SAM. So the SAM registry key is stored in I think it's like HKLM/SAM, and then because it stores passwords for all the local users, if you can dump them correctly, you get the NTLM hash of all the local users. So some requirements for this would be, of course, network access or command execution. Um, the biggest thing as well would just be to have SE backup privileges or administrative contacts. So with SE backup privileges, you can essentially like back up the registry key and just download them offline. That would be one way to do it. Another with administrative privileges would just be to use netexec. So if you have admin privileges, you can just run the netexec way. But if you have SE backup, actually, I think you could still use netexec way with SE backup. Yeah, I mean, Windows is very weird on how it works, but yeah, netexec is your best friend. This is one example using the administrator accounts and its password. So essentially, you would get this kind of output, and then you would just copy the NT hash because these are all blank LM hashes. So just copy the NT hash, and then you can do like pass the hash with that or whatever you want, right? For dumping LSA, pretty much the same requirements as SAM. Uh, Command execution on a host or with administrative contacts. Um, I'm not sure if LSA can be backed up with SE backup. I don't really see why not. Um, but same thing, netexec dash dash LSA. I believe you can do the same thing with LDAP, but I'm not entirely sure. And then this would be the output, right? So this long hash for the computer account is not very helpful just because like if you have admin privileges on the machine, you might as well just copy the LM hash. But sometimes, right, you're going to have plain text credentials when you dump LSA. And those would be like the passwords that you're going to be using. This is not a very good example, but one thing you can get from LSA, especially would be the computer's NTLM hash. I think from this image, that would be the most valuable. For WDP API, again, you're going to be using netexec, but there's also a way to dump it manually, which is a lot more advanced version. Hacker Recipe has a great walkthrough on how to do that. Well, it's not great, but it does show you how to do it. Um, so requirements again, you're going to have execution on the machine. So when I refer to command execution, I'm more so referring to just having a session on the machine, right? So if you like do Evo 1RM or RDP, those will all fall under command execution. And technically speaking, you would need administrative context when using the API. But if you have credentials stored in a compromised account, you can dump those credentials for that account, which may lead to other accounts. Then you can dump more. It's very conditional, but it never hurts to dump DPPI with whatever user. So this would be an example of EPAPI dumping. So we see all these different passwords, right? From Google Chrome, you have John McClane and YipyK, Bon Clay, One Piece 123, et cetera, right? So these would be examples of grabbing DPAPI secrets from things like um, browser passwords. Yeah. So if you can actually run DPPI successfully, and those credentials lead to some other user, you can definitely try using that credential somewhere else on the domain. So it could be like a different computer, the domain controller, maybe the same computer as you dumped it on, etc. Right? Just some things to look out for whenever you get valid credentials, just spray them everywhere and see if they have different privileges locally rather than on the domain. Because it's definitely possible for a low privileged domain user to have local admin on another computer. So always just try whatever you can. Not necessarily brute force it, but just do what you can. And then dumping NTDS.dit. Oops. So the NTDS.dit stores all the domain controller um information, right? So it will hold like NTLM hashes of all the users because if a domain controller is trying to replicate that information to their domain controller, it needs to have the same users. So the ntds.dit file is essentially like a file for domain controllers to copy and paste domain information. And to dump this, you're going to require domain admin credentials or replication privileges. And ultimately, upon success, you're going to gain domain credentials for all users. Some examples of dumping NTDS would be the --NTDS flag, as well as using secret dump with the file itself along with the system local for the system file. So the netexec way is just dumping it over the network, and then secrets dump way is dumping it locally on your Kali machine. Another thing to note about ntds.dit is that it's also called DC sync because you're syncing the domain controllers. So oftentimes you're going to be seeing those two names interchangeably. This is an example of DC syncing. So an attacker discovers a domain controller and requests for DC for replication. The DC then returns the hashes for all the domain users because you're trying to replicate it, right? So it's kind of self-explanatory. You get all the hashes from the DC, so then you can use those hashes to authenticate as whoever you want, right? I don't think I have a demo for this. Yeah, I don't have a demo for this. I know it is heartbreaking. I don't want to give you guys domain admin's credentials. But so exfiltrating files, right? So whenever you're exfiltrating files, there are multiple ways you can do it. One way that I like to use like when web servers are not available or when RM is not available is that with SMB server. So on your attacker Kali, you can make a SMB server which the Windows machine can then connect to. So on the victim machine, you can connect to your Kali's SMB share and just copy over the file because that's an intended way of using SMB as a file share. Another way would just be with EvilWinRM. EvilWinRM has a feature called download where you can just straight up download the file. It is longer if to download big files with through WinRM compared to SMB server, but ultimately EvilWinRM is easier, right? So passing the hash. When you pass the hash, you're basically passing the NT hash over the network. So to perform this, you get the NT hash and you just use it as a form of authentication. Typically with tools like WinRM, you're going to have like a dash capital H flag where you can just pass the hash. And essentially, because NTLM hashes are a form of pre-authentication, it is a valid way of proving who you are. This is mainly because when you submit an authentication request, the host challenges your password to see if it's encrypted. So, or if it's the right password, right? So the host sends a random number and it tells the client to encrypt your password with this random number and then send it back. If the two encryptions match what the hosts have, then it confirms or denies what if it's allowed or not. So essentially with pass the hash, right, I believe it's just skipping these two first steps and it's just sending an NTLM response. Don't quote me on that, but that's how I like to believe. That's how it works. So yeah, going back to the evil 1RM example, you're going to have dash capital H and then the NT hash. That same format also applies to netexec, where you have dash capital H and then the NT hash. Whenever using things like in packet, you're going to have, it's going to require you to use the LM hash as well. But even though it's empty, you still have to have it just for syntax handling. Oh, finally done. Okay. So I went really quick with that one. Um, there are bugs in the environment I gotta fix really quick, but everything should it should be fine. So overall for the homework, you're going to perform four attacks, right? Perform four attacks and write up about it. Same thing as last week. Some examples would be like Kerberos, pasta hash, credential dumping, ACL abuse, etc., right? Bonus points if you find exploits that aren't mentioned within the presentation. So things like ADCS or some kind of delegation, things like that, right? Um, Pretty much the same instructions as last week, right? Provide as much steps for your attacks as possible. Explain the theory behind the attack. So like explain why or what the attack require for the attack to work. If you look back on the slides, I keep on saying that you require network access, you require credentials. So it would just be like things like that. And include why the attacker might consider this attack. So like what did they gain? For DC syncing, they gain full domain control because they have passwords over, or they have the NTLM hashes for all users on the domain. For Kerber roasting, you get passwords because you crack the password offline. Um, and again, screenshot your results, screenshot your commands, explain what each command does. So I don't want you guys to just keep on copying and pasting commands from online and just running it, because that is a very common thing that you will see in pen testing or red team in general. People can copy and paste commands wherever they want, but they don't know the theory behind it. And because of that, they don't know how to effectively communicate to their clients. And that is a very bad trait to have as a pen tester or a red teamer. Um, so definitely look into the theory behind the attacks. If you need help or need me to explain some stuff, feel free to DM me. Um, some machines may require like a reboot to work. If that happens, just DM me and I'll try to fix something. Otherwise, you may just have to redeploy. But don't be afraid to ask for help. I mean, I'm here to help you guys learn. So just DM me when if you ever need help with theory or like you need a hint for something. And yeah, I think that's some resources you can use, right? Um, a lot of URLs, a lot of resources for attacking Active Directory. The main thing would just be hacker recipes. Hacker recipes is like a giant database for attacking Windows. Thank you, Luke. So definitely look at hacker recipes. Definitely a great place to start looking for attacks. And yeah, that should be everything. Any questions? I know like I was stuttering a lot, but like,
Oh, I have a question.
yeah, what's up?
So going back to like the zero logon CVE,
Yeah.
since this is a pen test, and I know that like CVE would be potentially damaging, especially to the domain controller. So would you want us to run it in the environment and report on it if we find that it's susceptible?
Oh, so again, as you said, zero logon is very harmful to the domain controller, right? But there's also scripts to enumerate to see if it's vulnerable or not without actually executing it. I think it's let's see if I can find it. Can I get rid of this? Guess not. Uh, scroll up. Yeah, this one, I think. No, that's an exploit.
And I left it in chat.
Oh, you put it in chat?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, the secure BV one is the one that doesn't actually perform the exploit, but checks if it's vulnerable. So whenever you're in a pen test engagement and you suspect that something is vulnerable to that, you would use a secure BV proof of concept to check if you were if it's vulnerable or not. I was using Spice Viewer. So Spice Viewer is a tool that you can use on Proxmox to it allows copy and paste between Linux computers. I have not set it up for Windows computers yet because I was just lazy. But it's a free tool that you can use. It allows copy and paste, and honestly, I just like the feel of it better than using the web UI. I think, Luke, do you want to find the URL for that?
Sorry, which one?
What was that? I think it's like yeah, it's like this place. So you can download that if you want. I know Mac OS is a bit buggy with it. Um, I know Ryan Miller uses Mac OS and uses Spice, so you can ask him for help. Since I'm on Windows, it's pretty stable. But yeah, so to use Spice, you would just go to like console, Spice, and then it'll download a file. When you click on the file, it'll just delete itself. So no real need to worry about that. And yeah, that's basically everything on Spice. It just allows copy and paste. Any other questions? If anyone needs me to like go back to a slide, I can as well. Um, we got 60 slides to go back on, 70 slides. Yeah, and you guys are free to DM me questions about Windows theory and stuff. I may or may not have an answer for everything, but I'll try my best.